In this game, Carlsen sacrificed his queen to a rising Indian star, Arjun, who Carlsen himself called a madman. Arjun is playing white, and by the way, he is one of the very few individuals in history who ever crossed 2800 FIDE rating. Magnus Carlsen is playing black. So far, it's all standard theory. Black controls the square d4 and then develops his knight to also reinforce this control. Therefore, Arjun plays e3, getting ready to play d4 on the next turn, and he does just that. And what I really love about this game is how they both refuse to back down and will just keep fighting, keep pushing no matter what, as if their life depends on it, which turn it into a really fascinating battle. Anyway, so far, Carlsen trades on d4, and I'd say this is the very first critical moment of the game. As white advanced his pawn to d4, it's pretty clear that he can eventually push it forward and chase away this knight from c6, which puts black under this decision and under some pressure. If black were to castle, which Carlsen didn't, white could indeed push this pawn forward, chasing the knight away. The knight can't go to the center because white controls it. And if black doesn't want to go all the way back, then they need to go knight a5. And at first it looks like a decent move, as at least it hits this pawn. But of course white can just defend it. And now, the white position strategically is very close to just being winning. Because this knight, as we know, a knight on the rim is dim. It has no squares to go to. So is the bishop on b7, which is also totally restricted by this pawn chain. And if white only has the time to complete his development, that would indeed be totally winning for white actually. However, black could stay in the game here if he noticed this tactical motif. Sacrifice the knight by utilizing the power of this fianchettoed bishop, and for example, in a variation like that, black would stay in the game and black is actually doing well. In the actual game, Carlsen chose a much more straightforward way to block this move pawn d5. He just played pawn d5 himself, which initially seemed to make total sense. Black also establishes his presence in the center and attacks this pawn on c4. However, Arjun traded everything on d5 and then continued with this move knight to e5, which is actually a great move. Now, this is a discovered attack of the queen, but it's not only the queen, because after that the bishop x-rays also this knight on c6 as well as the bishop and maybe even the rook, so the bishop is really monstrous across this diagonal. Now, what can black do? Well, taking on d4 would certainly be a huge blunder for a number of different reasons, for example due to this in-between check, and after this the queen is lost. This position occurred in some games before, and in all of them black just retreated the queen back to d6. The downside of this is that it's a little bit of passive, and white still has a number of ways to just keep increasing pressure with queen a4 or maybe bishop f4 attacking from this side, and it's quite tough for black to defend it. But Carlsen refused to defend and instead created total Magnus by sacrificing his queen right here on g2. So what's the point? Well, after king takes, black's got one more sudden move, knight takes d4. This time it's a discovered check to the king, and after the king moves, or white covered in the game, then black also can get one more minor piece. Black is still down material. He sacrificed basically a queen for two minor pieces, and it's not enough. So this is a sacrifice in style of Mikhail Tal, where objectively speaking the sacrifice is not completely sound, but in a practical game it's still quite hard for white to handle it, because his king is this time a little bit exposed, black is putting pressure down here, this diagonal, and if black can castle and put his rook to d-file, this can very quickly get very dangerous for white. Therefore, Arjun needs to be super careful to defend his position at this point, even though he's up a queen. And it's interesting to see how he handles this situation. So first off, he plays bishop e3, and I think it's a great move. I gave it an exclamation mark not because in this particular position it's such a strong move, in this case it's pretty natural to play it, but in general I think it's a great rule for all of us to follow. Whenever you see an opponent's piece on your side of the board, it's your first priority to get rid of it, and in this case it is this knight on d4. Because when your opponent's got a piece on your side of the board, this is a constant source of troubles. That is why you always need to attack it and get rid of it, and bishop e3 does just that. Carlsen played knight f5 with a counter strike to the bishop. Now, most of the ordinary players would probably just retreat the bishop somehow or defend it, but Arjun comes up with another counter strike, queen a4, forcing the black king into this walk of shame. And I really love how in this game they both keeps fighting and keeps counter and counter attacking. None of them want to defend. So queen a4 is a great move because it forces the king to move and therefore to lose the right of castle. white still needs to do something about this bishop on e3. But this time, instead of retreating the bishop back, Arjun got one more option. He played bishop f4. And that is another move with a tempo. It attacks the bishop and forces black to make a decision. Notice that prior to this check, bishop f4 move was not really possible, because after the trade, that would ruin white's pawn structure. But now, because the bishop is guarded, this move becomes possible, and it forces Carlsen this time to make a decision. What is he going to do about that? Let's not forget that Carlsen is down a queen. He cannot just trade pieces and lose. He needs to be more aggressive. Therefore, he snatches this pawn on b2 and attacks the rook. At this point, Arjun played another great move. And both of these guys are monsters. Obviously, they both play super precise chess, despite this being a blitz game, actually. So here, rook b1, I think, would be a very natural move, trying to get the rook out of danger and to counter-strike. But the issue with that move is, after the bishop goes back, this rook has nothing to do on the b-file. The pawn on b6 is very well defended, and the rook does nothing here. While the bishop on f6 would stand pretty well. So instead, Arjun goes rook d1, putting the rook to an open file where it has something to do and potentially can go forward and attack. Carlsen goes king g7, somewhat completing this artificial castling. Now his rook is ready to be brought into the game, but white plays rook d7. He starts attacking once again. This time he hits the bishop, and somehow this bishop does not have any convenient squares to go to. Like, white is controlling all the squares in front, where the bishop would love to go to theoretically, and therefore Carlsen has to play bishop c8, a move back which normally black certainly does not want to play, but in this case, at least once again he plays an attacking move and still fights for the initiative. Now, I keep saying that they both play great moves, but it is true. Now, the most natural move for white to play here would be to just capture this pawn on a7, right? Because you can win a free pawn. But here Arjun played rook c7, which is actually a great move, because he realized that although he could take this pawn and win it, but he would trade his active rook for this passive rook in the corner, which did nothing. So he prefers to not win a pawn, but instead to maintain this active rook, which keeps putting pressure, and now black still needs to defend very accurately. So far I praised Arjun more, but I gotta give credit to Carlsen as well. I mean, definitely he is a great player, and there is something that we can learn from him. So here, in this position, it is black to play. And the move which comes to mind first is bishop e6, because black needs to complete his development somehow. But Carlsen didn't play this move. And why is that so? I noticed that strong players in general, and Carlsen in particular, really love keeping their pieces consolidated, where they stand close to each other and support each other. In this position, there is this bishop on b2, which is a little bit loose. It is not attacked by white, but it is also somewhat in white's territory, and it is not supported by other pieces of black. And now if white goes something like g4, also pushing this knight out, it makes black's position really dangerous, because now this knight does not have any obvious safe squares to go to, this bishop is a little bit loose, and it's very easy for black to blunder something. For example, to play knight d4, and then after bishop e5, basically it's time for black to resign, they lose this knight on d4. So, instead of all that, Carlsen played a much more prudent move. He played the move here, bishop to f6, retreating the bishop back to safety, and now everything is well protected. The bishop, this pawn on e7, and although black still hasn't developed his other pieces, but at least he's very solid. By the way, if you want to know how to reduce the quantity of blunders in your games, I've got a free masterclass where I teach you how to do that. I'll drop a link below the video in the description, so check this out if you're interested, because if you just reduce the quantity of blunders, that's instantly like +2 or even 300 rating points straight away. Now, after bishop f6, white goes rook e1. There are no particular threats, but he just brings his last piece into the battle and puts it to a semi-open file, and Carlsen goes bishop e6, makes sense, completing his development. Now, white goes bishop e5, trading off this black bishop on f6. And this is one of the questions that you guys have asked me about many times, like, what's up with the power of two bishops that title players keep talking about? Like, what does that really mean? Well, if you look at both bishops of black, they control so many squares around the board that it indeed makes it quite hard to deal with them, because they have this super huge scope of attack. And if you can trade off just one of them, which white did in the game, now white's position becomes a lot more comfortable, because every piece of white which stands on a dark square can no longer be attacked by the bishop, which makes it a little bit useless in a way. Because if you imagine that in an ideal world for white can put all of his pieces to black squares, the bishop would not be able to attack anything. So that is how it's much easier to deal with one bishop compared to two. Now, Carlsen goes rook c8, finally bringing his rook into play and also trying to get rid of this annoying active rook on c7. And after the trade on c8, here again, Carlsen basically is offering this pawn on a7 to white, but white played a much better move, pawn to g4. He wants to get rid of this active knight on f5, because if instead white was seduced by this pawn, then there is this rook c2, which is super annoying, because what can white do now? There's no easy way for white to get rid of these jacks, and you don't want to go here because of this x-ray, and it really is very inconvenient. That is why in the actual game, instead of taking the pawn, Arjun played g4, kicking this knight out and also preparing this g3 square for his king. And at this point it looks like black's attack failed, white is up a queen, and basically it's time for black to resign. If the knight goes somewhere, white will just pick up this pawn on a7, attack all the other pawns of black from there, and it's an easy win for white. However, Carlsen this time played a brilliant move, rook to c4, with a counterattack of white's queen. He still fights back, which still makes the game very interesting. Now, the white queen needs to move somewhere, so Arjun just grabbed this pawn on a7, but this time, the queen no longer guards the square c2. That was the whole point of Carlsen. And therefore, instead of retreating the knight, black's got one more in-between check. In-between move, I should say, checking the king. And here, computer says that king h3 was better for white, probably, but it's more natural for a human to play king g1, but it's an inaccuracy, and now the knight can not just move away, but play knight d4, creating a super strong threat to this pawn on f3. From there, it's gonna fork the king and rook, and somehow Carlsen managed to create this counterplay out of nowhere. Now Arjun played rook e3 to guard the pawn, but now bishop d5 adds one more attack, and all of a sudden white can no longer defend it. So Arjun ended up just taking the other pawn, but then knight takes f3, delivers this check, and now white has to give up the rook. The king can now move away, if king into f1, let's say bishop c4 is almost a checkmate, white is just losing here. So instead, I mean, king h1 is also not an option because of this checkmate. So instead, white has to give up the rook, which he did, and all of a sudden Carlsen actually successfully equalized. Now white had to give back some material, now this pawn is hanging, this pawn is hanging, and now the position, objectively speaking, is equal. Nevertheless, the game goes on. Arjun plays pawn g5, getting the pawn out of danger, and also creating the threat of queen to f6 with a double attack to the king and bishop on f3. Now, quick question to you. Where would you move the bishop? It's pretty clear that queen f6 is a threat, so what are you going to do about that? Now, remember the rule we talked about before. Try to keep your pieces connected where they defend each other. One of the very natural blunders for black would be something like this, where you try to get bishop to this secure position, but then after queen e5, black resigns immediately. So Carlsen obviously knows that, and he played the move bishop h5, where the bishop is super well protected. Like, ideally, you wish to keep your pieces closer to the center, but here, at least, you don't blunder a bishop, which is already nice. Now, here's another interesting moment. At this point, Arjun decided to keep pushing and keep trying to play for a win. Now, one of the good ways, or I should say natural ways for white to proceed here would be to deliver this check, and after the king moves, now there is this pawn, so I can take it, black would in return recapture this pawn on a2, and now it's a simple position, it's a draw. Now basically black's got a fortress, there is nothing white can do here. But instead white goes pawn a4, and I give it an exclamation mark for the fighting spirit. White wants to save this pawn, because that's the only hope for white to win this game. Basically, the black king is very secure now, and white has only queen left on the board. There is no chance to checkmate black, but white's only chance would be to win this pawn on b6 and then to promote his own pawn along the a-file, and this is how white can possibly win. So now black needs to be careful, and Carlsen goes rook c4, once again keeping an eye on this pawn, and that's how Carlsen wants to get a draw. He wants to trade these pawns, so if white gets this pawn, for example, after queen f6, and black would get this pawn, again, that is a draw. So Arjun goes queen e5 check, and after king g8, queen b5. He still fights for a win. He guards this pawn on a4, not letting black capture it, and he says, you know what? I'm gonna push a rook away, grab this pawn on b6, promote my own pawn, and win. But of course, it's not that simple when you're facing Carlsen. He goes rook g4 check, and after king to f2, he played pawn h6. The move which looks strange at first, because white can just take this pawn, and white did so, but black's idea was that after king h7, white will probably not be able to hold on to this pawn, and therefore black would be able to just exchange it. And in general, there is a rule which states that while defending, you should trade pawns, and if you're adding material, you should trade pieces. So here, black does want to trade as many pawns as he can. As you know, if it's a clear board out of pawns, then even having a bishop or a knight is not enough to win the game. That's how trading of pawns help you a lot if you wish to achieve a draw. So here, white goes pawn h3. He still tries to adhere to his plan. He wants to kick the rook out of the 4th rank so it no longer attacks this pawn, and after that, white would be able to pick up the black pawn on the queen side. So Carlsen goes rook f4 check, king g3, counter strike, rook f3. I really love how in this game they both come up with attacking moves or counter-attacking moves all along the way. Now king to g2, white successfully achieved his goal, and now black needs to do something. The a4 pawn is no longer attacked, therefore queen takes b6 threat is real. White wants to capture it and then push his best pawn forward. Carlsen here played the move rook f4, which makes a lot of sense logically, as that was his main defensive plan, to keep an eye on this pawn and to trade queenside pawns. But here Arjun kind of says, you know what, you've been in fact Magnus Blunderson, because after queen e5, that's a double attack to the rook, as well as this sudden checkmating threat, and Carlsen had to resign. Sad for Carlsen because the position was objectively drawn, but nevertheless Carlsen later managed to win this match against Arjun. And if you want to know 5 most common mistakes regarding pawn moves and pawn structures, check out this video where I break it down for you.